So if I had to ask you all, if you're creative, I have a pretty good feeling that a lot of you would say, no, no, I'm not creative. And my answer to you would then be, no, you're wrong. You are creative. You're all creative in your own individual ways, just in different ways, but you're all equally creative, just as each other. And a couple years back, I was working with some kids, and I came with a new mind hack that I'm going to present to you today. And I want all of you to leave today feeling that you've been empowered with a little bit more creativity. Because some of you, if I gave you a sheet of paper and the task to create something interesting, a lot of you would just go ahead and start folding it into like an origami lizard or something. And some of you would stare at it for hours and hours and hours, and then finally just sheepishly draw a little smiley face. I'm so ashamed. So the key to the mind hack is to not think outside the box. Let's think inside the box. So I'm going to take it back a couple years to when I was in high school. I used to coach an elementary school team of little kids, and they would be given a task like, I give you guys a clock, and I take that second hand off the clock. Now I want you to replace the second hand on the clock with something unique. So go ahead, think about it. A lot of you might say something like, oh, a toothpick, a needle, something of the same size and dimension as an actual second hand, you know? If you're really creative, or not that creative, but if you're thinking a little bit more outside the box, maybe you'll say something like, oh, a toothbrush, a spoon, you know, something a little bit out there. But how do we get to that 5-point answer? Because I was rating these kids from a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most creative, 1 being the least creative. And I needed to get a way to get my kids to give answers that were 5-point answers consistently every single time. And I couldn't just keep on telling them, oh, okay, guys, think outside the box, you know, be different, think different. I needed to give them something that they could rely on every single time, you know? And what I did is that I had these kids start making a limitation for themselves. I had them say, okay, so now you have to replace the second hand, and now the second hand has to be green. And they would start saying things like, oh, it's going to be a dinosaur's tail, or it's going to be Elphaba, the witch's finger, you know? I said, now let's make the second hand alive. And now they would say things like Angelina Jolie's right leg. That was back in the day. Back then. They would say things like stick bug. They would say things like giraffe. All of a sudden, because they had a limitation, they started thinking more creatively because they're using that limitation to fuel and make a guideline for them to reach that more creative response. It was filtering out the cliche. It was filtering out the needle, the toothpick, the twig. It was filtering out all of that. And that really brings me to my point. The box strategy, which I now call it, is the entire idea is that you want to think inside the box. You want to think with a limitation. Because when you think with a limitation, that limitation provides you a guideline to get to that creative response. Because what happens is that when you're looking at a blank sheet of paper, when you're given too much freedom to create, the first thing that comes to mind is the most cliche statement, the most cliche idea, the most like trite thing, you know? And that's disgusting. We don't want that. We don't want that. We want creative responses. We want creative ideas because that's what fuels everything. And the way to get that is to not drown in a sea of possibilities. It's to get on a boat, and that boat should be your limitation. So today, like when you're thinking about ideas, when you're thinking about responses, think with the limitation. Just try that out. And this box strategy is not new. We've seen this again and again. We've seen it in history. We've seen it in art. And a great example is in 1970, we had the Apollo 13 space mission. And what happened, this is a really famous story. What happened is the astronauts were up there in space. They were supposed to orbit the moon, and they had to abort the mission. And the reason is the carbon dioxide tanks were round. And the carbon dioxide tanks, 2 of them, malfunctioned. And the replacement cartridges were square. So it was literally a case where they had to find a way to put a square peg into a round hole, you know? And they only had a couple hours. The carbon dioxide was starting to get saturated inside the cockpit. And the astronauts could have died. They only had a couple hours. So engineers back at the John F. Kennedy Space Center here in Florida had to find a way to fit this square peg into a round-shaped hole using nothing but the materials that were already on the spaceship. Nothing but the materials that were already on the spaceship was the creative limitation in this case. They created this square thing that has that tube. They called it a mailbox rig. And they would not have been able to come to that conclusion. They would not have been able to come to that new innovative idea using nothing but plastic bags and cardboard boxes and duct tape. They wouldn't have been able to make that innovation if they hadn't had that creative limitation, which was the limited amount of tools or limited amount of supplies on the spacecraft. And because of that, they were successful. The astronauts made it back. So the box strategy saved lives. It has. And we see it today. We see it today. We see it in social media. Twitter is a great example of the box strategy in action. You're only allowed 140 characters. The limited amount of space, the 140 characters that you have, is a creative limitation. Because of that, the hashtag was born. You're only allowed to express your thoughts or your ideas, the news, or your opinions only in a limited amount of space. Because of that, people express their thoughts in new ways. It's not Facebook, it's not just any blog. You have to do it in the most creative way possible. And Twitter has forced users to be as creative as they possibly can because they give them a limited amount of space. And that's a great example of box strategy in action. And so I'll bring it back to the clock example. It sounds kind of silly, right? I'm not going to replace the second hand on a clock at home with a giraffe, right? But that's just an example to get you starting to think that a limitation will actually lead you to something really colorful out of the box, you know? And we should use the box strategy in our work, in our everyday life. And I'm a medical student, so I'll go ahead and apply it to medicine. A couple years back, I was in Nicaragua, and I was doing a little bit of medical mission work there. And it shouldn't have been so surprising, I should have realized, but there was just such an abject lack of medical tools and diagnostic kits, and just the basic necessities that we have for care in the United States was not there. And so the creative limitation in that case was we didn't have the same diagnostic tools. And because of that, people have invented really interesting things like this. This is an ECG pad using Bud Light caps, you know? By facing the creative limitation, which is a lack of medical supplies in developing nations, medical students, like in this case, there was a professor at Duke University named Robert Malkin and a couple of his students created a new method of creating ECG pads using nothing but little bottle caps, you know? And because of that creative limitation, which was the lack of materials in those countries, we have arrived to this new innovative way of making cheap medical supplies using nothing but recyclable materials, you know? So I charge you all with the box strategy. Place creative limitations on yourself. Make the challenges you see more challenging. You know, it sounds like it's a difficult thing, but if you do this in your everyday life, you'll see it everywhere. I want you all to think inside the box. Thank you.